Hey friends, and welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Morgan and you are on my homestead here in Wyoming. And today we are getting the garden all prepped. We are going to lift up all of these tarps. We're going to get them rototilled underneath and then laid back down. And then we're going to put all of the wood along the aisles to make sure that the wind doesn't get underneath. I live in a very windy climate, so we have to make sure we have this super pinned down. So come along with us today. We've got my parents here in the background helping out as well, and we're gonna get this garden going. So just to give a little bit of background information if you're new here this year, in my garden I use the till method and I also use weed cloth. There's kind of two main methods. You can use a till method, which is what you can see my dad doing here, which is where you take a big rototiller and loosen up the ground that way. Or you can do a no-till method, which is where you can either build up the soil or you can just kind of go in the ground, but you don't till it up, you don't use any heavy machinery, and you keep the ground natural or don't disturb the surface. I find where I live, the till method works best for me. I have a really good soil with a ton of nutrients in it. It's really strong, so I have found that the till method is the direction that works great for me, but I do highly encourage you to do your own research and figure out what's going to be your best solution. I know when you're kind of doing above ground gardening or gardening in the planters, traditionally people will go with the no-till, obviously because you can't get the equipment in there, but when in ground, I have found for my exact situation, the till method works best. So when we first moved here, we had a teeny tiny little tiller and would use it to till this entire garden. I'll be honest, it kind of kicked my booty. It was absolutely exhausting to try to keep down, and so 2 years ago, we invested in this larger rototiller, and I was laughing because you can see I still haven't even taken the tags off of it. Clearly that wasn't a priority. I was just trying to get it going. But I will say investing in the right equipment and just making sure you have the right tools for the job is so important. And I do seriously encourage you to really do your research if you decide that tilling is the right method for you. Make sure you know how to operate this machine safely. They're all totally different, so make sure you kind of know what you're doing before you get behind one of these machines, as they are, or at least can be, pretty dangerous and pretty heavy duty. I have said it before and I will say it again, Wyoming is a pretty windy climate. So I decided that it would be best to keep last year's weed cloth down throughout the winter and this spring to help ensure that we got less seeds of the weeds blowing into the garden. Here it's just tough because we back up to so much wild land with a ton of weeds in it that I feel when I leave it uncovered, the weed seeds are able to blow in throughout the winter, and then in the spring, the weeds already get to growing and I feel like I'm battling them all year round. So I kept my weed cloth down. Obviously the lifespan of it's going to be less if I keep it down in the winter, but that is something that I've decided I'm absolutely fine with. So I left it down, and you can see my parents are back there just pulling the pins. I do have fence posts running against the weed cloth, and that was to keep it down from the wind last year. Obviously, we don't want to do all this work and have nothing holding down the weed cloth because that's a really great recipe for my little plants to get ripped out when a huge windstorm comes along. So I had these weed cloth nailed down and then had boards running across it. So my parents are just taking that out, and then in the areas where we don't have weed cloth, this year I'm going to be putting potatoes in that area that I'm tilling right now. I'm going to go ahead and just get that all tilled up. I honestly felt so grateful to have my parents here helping. You can see that my dad is using this kind of lever that he invented to go ahead and pull out the pins. We have foot-long pins that were holding these fence posts down, so he would go ahead and pull them, and then I was, once they were a clear distance away, going and tilling the part that they had pulled up the weed cloth from. And you can see there is absolutely no weeds underneath this weed cloth. It worked out so great and I absolutely loved it. So they would just get each row rolled and then I would till behind them. Honestly, I wouldn't have wanted to do this job with less than 3 people. It made it go a million times faster. Last year I did majority of this on my own and it was a very slow going process. So if you're interested in doing weed cloth or adding weed cloth into your garden, I highly recommend you recruit a little bit of a team to help you do so. The other great part about having a team helping you out with this is you have people to bounce ideas off of. So you can see my dad and I were kind of going back there. He was giving me ideas, I was giving him the thumbs up, and we were on our merry way. So I'm just going ahead and getting the rest of this tilled up, but I thought this was a perfect example of the lack of weeds. We are doing this in early May. Here in Wyoming, the fields behind us are green and there are absolutely no weeds. So that weed cloth is such a blessing. I remember the first year we lived here, the weeds were just an endless battle, or a never-ending battle, and I just couldn't keep up. But this weed cloth has made my garden so much more manageable, and I will definitely link this down below if you're interested in what we're using. And then we also have an automatic irrigation system that we put on top of the cloth that then allows the garden to be hands-off, so then I can have time to actually take care of the plants and take care of the harvest and all of that. Time is limited, so it's important that we are using it wisely. You can see here just how light and fluffy the tiller makes the ground, and it makes it so much more manageable. So my dad was then going in and doing a second pass kind of in the opposite direction. Sometimes the tiller will make a little bit of a shelf on the areas where we're passing through. So by going vertically and then horizontally, that helped ensure that we were getting rid of those shelves. And then while my dad was doing that, my mom and I were going through and were smoothing it out and evening the ground, just to make sure then we go through and put the weed cloth down that there is an even ground to put it on top of. After we got the ground all leveled, we are then going in and relaying the weed cloth. So I have a fence picket on the very end, and I have one wrap around that fence picket with the weed cloth, and then we drill that into the ground using a 12-inch stake. That way the edge of each of the weed cloths don't come up, and you can see how windy it is this day. You can see my dad's hood and jacket, and the grasses are all blowing around, and so definitely it's a lot easier to do this on a calm day, but here in Wyoming you never know when those are going to be, so we just rolled with it and we're just laying the tarp back down. Luckily we already have it measured from last year, so it was super simple in that aspect, and we just want to make sure that it's very, very tight, because if we get loose it can get wind under it, which will then rip the plants out. So we're just unrolling it, making sure it's straight, and then pinning it down every now and again to keep it safe from the wind. Then at this point, Sam had come home from work, so he was helping out in the garden as well, and we were really just going through and laying cloth, making sure the ground was level underneath, and then pinning it down. You can see here when it gets really windy, the weed cloth tends to lift a little bit, and that's why we lay those pickets down. That's what helps ensure that we can keep them in. So we got these as tight as we could that day, but then we wanted to wait to make sure that the wind had stopped before we really did kind of the final check on tightness. So we laid them pretty well, and then the next day we're going back in and getting them as tight as we possibly can.
So I'll just grab in some pins and I'll pound them in behind you.
Then, as you can hear my dad saying, we are just taking metal pins and pinning down the weed cloth, and then where we had a little bit of gap just because we were reusing these from last year, we're putting down a board. And so this is just from a scrap pile that we already have, and this is also working really well as a walkway. So rather than having to step on tilled ground, I just walk on these boards, and it helps keep the ground level and keep my footprints out of the ground. So it's kind of serving as a dual purpose. First being it helps keep the weed cloth down, and second, it works great for a runway. Now, one thing that's important to remember is if you don't live in a super windy climate, you probably don't need to go through all of this, so weed cloth will be a lot more simple. We tend to get storms or just days with 70 to 80 mile per hour wind, and so I need to make sure that my garden can stand a chance up against those winds. So this part's a little bit tedious, but for majority of you, this is probably a step you can skip or do a little bit later. Then you can see we're just going all the way down each of the aisles and pinning those down. That way we don't have to worry about blowing. We were making sure they were really, really tight because this was a calm day. And then as our final touch, we're putting those boards on top to kind of help seal everything down. So this did take a really long time, but it was so much easier with the three of us, and it made it go a lot quicker, and it was much more enjoyable.
I'm
hoping for with this rain is it'll loosen the ground, and then when it dries, it'll just dry the stakes in. You know?
Right. I got it.
That's not my angle. Made that look easy. All right, and that is it for today. We have our garden all tarped, and then we have this area here so we can plant potatoes and make sure that we're still hilling them up. Thank you guys so much for joining us. If you liked today's video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing, and we will catch you in the next one. Bye, friend.